Now, I want to show you something here because that has just happened with me. There are times when you save your file and you can see it went real fast and the hot reload worked fine. But if hot reload stalls, meaning that it just keeps saying hot reload, on Windows, it's going to be you go to File and you find Preferences and then go to Settings. But on Mac, I go to Code and to go Preferences and I go to Settings. Or I could just go Command, comma, like this, as you can see there, it should open it. So if I say Command, comma, it should go ahead and open our settings. Okay. Here, what I want you to do is to type hot reload like this. So once you see hot reload like that, what you need to do, probably yours is going to say manually, which is the default. So in this case here, I'm just going to go ahead and say, so what you may need to do is to say always, as it is like that. Okay. Change that to always if you're having that issues, and then you can get out and rerun your VS Code and it should be good. Only if you're having that issue where the hot reload is stalling, that's probably something that may help. Now we need to figure out how to filter all these users because we may have more than one. Obviously, a lot of people are going to be logging in. We're going to filter through and find the correct user through the UIID, which is going to be connecting to the actual authenticated user. In this case would be Gina or me or John, whatever we have here. To make our lives much easier, I'm going to create a class, a data class that will represent a user. Now keep in mind that again, like I said, we have a user from Firebase auth, which is a different thing. We're just going to create another user type for our users from our Firestore. Inside here, inside of models, I'm going to just create a new file, call this user.dart. Okay. And here, because I know I don't want to collide with the user from Firebase, I'm going to say m user. That's what I'm going to call this class. Okay. Say class m user. And I'm going to just add a few fields here. So final. Now remember, these fields are literally going to be the fields that we have in our Firebase Firestore database, right? If you go to users, these are the fields that we're going to be adding as well. Final string, I'm going to get an ID for each user. Okay. Then final string UIID. Final string display name, quote, fashion, avatar, URL as such. Now it's going to complain because we need to actually create a constructor of some sort to initialize these fields. So command period, create constructor with all of these. Life's good. And what I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to make these named parameters. That way we can see the fields as we invoke m-user. So next, I'm going to create a factory function that will map this user here, which is going to be coming in as a map, into an actual object. In this case, this object m-user here. So I'm going to say factory m-user. I'm going to say from, call this from document. And I know that it's going to be coming in as a query document snapshot. When we call this to get a user, it's going to come in as a query document snapshot. So that is the type I'm going to pass here. Query document snapshot. Call this data as such. And I'm going to say return m-user. I'm going to use the m-user constructor. And for the ID, there we go. It's going to be from data.id directly, right? From each user will have its own, actually it's not user, but in this case it's going to be the document ID, which we'll need later to edit and do all sort of things. And then UIID, it's going to be, I'm going to say data. Notice data is a query document snapshot, which means I have to go inside into the data object, right? And then that's when I'm going to go ahead and invoke the UIID as such. Continue, display is going to be the same thing, display underscore name, because remember it has to be exactly the same names as these fields. Okay. Finalize semicolon. So we would want to map the other way around. If we want to pass, for instance, the user, we want to make it so that it looks like a map. So I'm going to use create another method here called to map. It's going to expect a map, okay, of the string dynamic, that's for keys, values that is, and I'm going to call this to map. Doesn't have to take in anything. And this thing I'm going to say return a map, right? So the UIID It's going to be mapping to UI ID. Display name. It's going to be display name. Sure this works. URL is going to be avatar URL. Okay, let's put semicolon like this. Now, why are we having this issue? Well, the reason being, if you hover over this data, right, the actual functions that returns something, it just says returns object. It should say returns a map, right? Because this really, when it comes back, it all comes back as a map. So this is one problem that I'm noticing now that I have created this project. Now, I'm not sure if you're going to have this problem, but if you do have this problem where you hover over this data here, right, the second one, and it just says object like this is the problem, because it shouldn't be just a generic object. It should be a map object. That's why we're having issues here that says the operator brackets, square brackets isn't defined for the type of object. It makes sense. It only works if we know that whatever is coming in from our data is actually a map. That's the whole reason why we're doing this. To fix this issue, I'm going to transform this data that we're getting here, and not just a query document snapshot. I'm going to go ahead and extract the map. So I'm going to create a map here, which is going to be string dynamic, like that. I'm going to call this, just say info, and I'm going to use our data that we're getting, this one here, say data, data like this. So now I'm just, if you hover over this one, this is what we need. We need a map of string and dynamic, okay, to confirm to what we have coming in. So in this case, I'm just going to use the info instead of all of this. I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of all of that, and you notice that things should now look good. Now, if you don't see this issue, then just do like this. You shouldn't have an error. But if you do have this problem here, this is what you need to do. All right, then we have our user, m-user done. Let's go back to our main screen. So this is where we need to filter through all of these users to make sure that we can get the current logged in user. I'm going to create a final, call this users list stream, and I'm going to call the snapshots. Remember, we are inside of stream builder query. We're going to be expecting to receive a query snapshots, and we have that reference here because this references to the users collection, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to go snapshots. I'm going to go to data and then get the docs. And once I get to the docs, I'm going to use the map method there to allow us to map what we're getting so that we can actually have an object, a user object. So I'm going to convert that into a block, put a semicolon for now. Okay, so what are we going to do here? Well, here we're going to return. In fact, let's change this E to something meaningful. Notice it's a query document snapshot. Very good. Let's just change this to user as such. And now what I need to do, I'm going to use the m-user because there's that from document, because this is indeed a document type, query document snapshot, right? That's what's needed. So I'm going to pass the user through like that. So that is going to go ahead now and return an actual, and map, I should say, the user that we're getting here as a map into an object, right? So using what we just created, this method here from document, we pass that query snapshot document, and we are parsing all through and make it into an actual user object. So that way we can say m-user.id, we can get that field. All right, so we have our user list here, but we're not done, because remember, once we have this list here, we need to loop through, figure out a way to cipher through and find the user that has the UID field containing the same ID as the Firebase user that is logged in. And we can do that because remember, this is all just one statement. So if I come down here and I hit dot, I can go ahead and use the where method. The where method allows us to also go through what we just received, this users, right, in the raw form, and we can look for something, right? So in this case, let's go ahead and also convert this to a block body. Put a semicolon there. All right, so this element you hover over, it's indeed a user element, m-user element, which means it's an object user of our own that we created. That's really good. Now that we have this element, what we need to do is to check. I can actually say user like this, not to be confused with this user, but this one here, okay? Now I'm going to say something like this. Return, I want to return something, but to return this something, I need to say user.UIID, because remember each user has a UID, okay, is equal to what? It's going to be equal to the current user, so I'm going to say Firebase auth instance.current user.UIID. If this is true, then we're just going to go ahead and fetch that user that has the same ID as the user that is currently logged in. We should return just one user. Actually, we should just have one user, but because when we hover over, notice this is going to return an iterable M user. So essentially, it's going to just return a list of users. So I'm going to make this into a list. I'm going to say .toList to make it easier for us to work with. So because now it's going to be a list, which means it's going to have something like this with a user, should just have one user, which means we're just going to have a 0th index with one user. So I can then say, create that user object again. I'm going to say muser, so we can use it anywhere we want. I'm going to say cur user is going to be equal to users list. And I'm just going to go ahead and grab the first one. It should be one anyway, but we do that. So now we have this current user, which is an object we can use. I can say cur user. I can go ahead and invoke display, ID, and all these other things. All right. So in this case here, since I have this current user, I could go ahead here in a username. I can change that, and I'm going to say something like current user dot. Let's put that inside of curly braces. And I can go ahead and say avatar, let's display name, because that's something that we know should have. Let's start again, display name like this. And there we have it. Okay, let's go ahead and save this. And I lost connection. Let's go ahead and rerun the whole thing. Okay, let's just log ourselves in again to make sure everything works perfectly. Tester, let's see. Okay, sign in. Okay, let's see. And you can see here says Gina. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so you can see. And voila, Gina is showing because it went ahead. We logged in as Gina and there is Gina there. Very good. So we are getting the correct user. Now, check this out. The other thing we can do is just to show you how wonderful this is. We have a button here, the text button, which is this one here. Let's log ourselves out real quick. How would we log ourselves out? Let's go inside of our pressed method there. I'm going to say Firebase instance like this, out, just like this. Now, when I sign out, I want to also invoke the then promise method. I'm going to make this an actual block. In this case here, I want something to happen. Well, I'm going to return a navigator. I'm going to say push. Context is passed, and the route here I'm going to use material page route, which requires me to pass in a builder of some sort. And because there's just one line of code that we need, I can just pass this anonymous arrow function like that, and then I want to take users back to login page. Okay, save this, and voila. Having issues again. Let me just stop all the way. Let's just rerun the whole thing. Okay, let's go ahead and actually create a new account so we can see if this actually works. So I'm going to create, let's say, litos@me.com and a password, create account. So this should create account, log this person in, and create a user. Let's see if that's true. And voila, you can see there's Litos there. I'm going to make this bigger, and there's Litos. There we go, that's good. And here we should see that we have Litos. Where is Litos? There we go, Litos. And we have that UID, which is good. That's why it's working. And if I go to our authentication, we should also see Litos there. Voila, so everything is working. At this point here, I can also sign myself out. If you click here, we should go back to enter email. I'm gonna go back to Lito. Is that Litos? I think Litos, yes, @me.com. Log in again, sign in. and we're still seeing Litos there. Perfect. So the plan is working. We're able to create a user. First of all, when we create an account, we can go ahead and create an account using the authentication here, authentication should say, Firebase authentication. At the same time, when that happens, we create a user document here. Under users, we create that document of that Firebase user created, and we pass in the actual UI ID of our authenticated user, so we have a way of communicating, of knowing which user connects with who. And then in our code, we have now a place where we check. We filter through all the users that may be there. We know there should be just one user that should match the Firebase user with the user in our database, right? And we get that user, create that object, and then we can just invoke whatever we want. In this case, just display name. We could have obviously gotten any of these fields here. And we're also able to log a user out or sign them out. The moment users sign out, we want to then invoke this then method here, which is a future, and then we return the users to login page.